It's great to see so many people here.
Thank you.
And hopefully it will be a really interesting couple of weeks exploring the unconscious, so the subconscious, the hidden sides of our psyche, and how they... Sorry. We should switch our phones off, right? Okay, that's off now. Really go through a journey of, I think, two really intercolliding worlds, the world of Kabbalah and the worlds of psychology, especially the psychoanalytical psychology. And there's a lot to be said about this topic, and I'm by no means an expert on either, but it's definitely an interesting comparison and analysis. So I hope we all enjoy this journey. I just want to start with a story to introduce tonight's topic. So the story is a Hasidic story. There's a Chassid who he has this wish, this dream that he's had for many, many years. He wants an opportunity to merit to see the prophet Elijah. Now we know in Jewish folklore, so this prophet Elijah crops up all the time in various forms, usually cloaked in robes with a long white beard, sort of a classic mystical figure. And at times of need, and when people are in distress, he appears and performs miracles. This is sort of archived throughout the ages. But there's also a Kabbalistic tradition that if a person goes through a process of refinement and purification, then they can merit to see this prophet Elijah. So he says, Rebbe, what should I do? I want to see Elijah the prophet. He says, okay, you need to fast for 30 days, only eat at night, go to the mikveh every morning, immerse yourself in the ritual bath, do this for 30 days, and then maybe you'll merit to see Elijah. And this is what he does. Every day, fasting, learning, studying, praying, meditating, and then at night just eating a little bit of bread and some water, and then in the morning again back into the mikveh, etc., etc., and this goes on for 30 days. And he gets to that end of the month and nothing happens. There's no revelation, no prophet. So he goes back to the Rebbe, he says, Rebbe, I don't understand, I did everything you told me and I didn't see Elijah the prophet. So he says to him, you really want to see Elijah? He says, yeah, I really want to see Elijah. Says, okay. Get a wagon, fill it up with food, with clothing, and head to a particular village. At the end of the village is a broken down house. There you will find Elijah. So he heads over to the village, finds a broken down house. There's a widowed mother with 7 children. They're living in extreme poverty. And he says, I'm here. My Rebbe told me to come here. He said, well, what are you doing for Shabbos? It's like a few minutes before Shabbos by the time he made it. He says, I don't know. I don't have any plans. But I've got a wagon full of food and I've got clothing and shoes and things. So why don't we spend Shabbos together? And they spend this beautiful Shabbos together, and he's singing and he's sharing Torah and he's giving attention to the children. It's a really beautiful experience. And Shabbos ends and he has to return to the village. Doesn't see Elijah. Goes back to the Rebbe and he says, Rebbe, I don't understand what you want from me. He says, be patient, just wait, continue your preparations, your divine service. So a few weeks later, it's 1 week before Rosh Hashanah, and he says, Rebbe, when am I going to see Elijah? He says, I want you to do the same thing again. Fill up the wagon with food and with clothing and with gifts and head down to that house in the end of the town, in that broken down little hut at the end of the village with the mother and her 7 children. So he heads down, and as he heads down, he hears the children screaming from the window, Mother, look! It's Elijah the prophet. He's on his way. So it's a cute story, but it's also very powerful. It's a deep story. You have Elijah the prophet. He existed it's archived. People saw him at times. But there's Elijah, the symbol of Elijah, what it means to be that Elijah the prophet. And for this particular person, the Rebbe was telling him, don't wait to see a revelation of Elijah. You have to become Elijah the prophet. You have to be Elijah the prophet. You are the person that you want to see. That's what you can become. So in exploring this idea of archetypes and symbols, we have to start to enter the world of symbolic understanding and enter this kind of space which is about looking at things about what they represent as an idea, as a concept, and transcending the literal meaning and looking at something as a symbol, as an image. So one of the great psychologists who really brought this concept to the forefront is Carl Jung. And the way I kind of heard about Carl Jung when I was studying counseling, we did this unit. It was the first year introduction to counseling, so every week we had to read up as much about one particular psychologist. So we had all the greats, and one of them was Jung. And what fascinated me the most about him was that so many of his concepts were very, very familiar to me from the learning I'd done in Chassidus and Kabbalah, but they're expressed in such a clear way. His language is very, very clear, and he sort of put a new, I guess, almost like a Western, for me at least, the Western language, as an English speaker, a real clear way of understanding very, very profound concepts. And one of his most profound concepts, I think, is this idea of archetypes, which is that essentially, embedded in a person's unconscious, in our psyche, are definitive kinds of constructs which all of humanity share. So it's something that is part of us as human beings, as people. There's so much more than just what we see, just what we feel, just our sensory experience. But there's something that we're perceiving at a very, very deep level that we're almost hardwired with as human beings. So I think the best way to sort of look at what he says is just by reading what he says. So I've put in a few paragraphs here that I'll just read out, and then we'll discuss a little bit. So the first one is from one of his books, and he says, an archetypal content expresses itself first and foremost in metaphors. If such a content should speak of the sun and then identify it with the lion, the king, the hoard of gold guarded by the dragon, or the power that makes for life and the health of man, it is neither one thing nor the other, but rather the unknown third thing that finds more or less adequate expressions in all these similes, yet to the perpetual vexation of intellect remains unknown and not to be fitted into a formula. So I guess it sounds a bit esoteric, but the idea is that it's about saying that there's certain key fundamental, I guess, deep concepts that we have as people. And depending on the culture that you come from, depending on the religion or the environment, whichever part of the world, that kind of concept will attach itself to some kind of symbol which represents best that concept. One of his most famous archetypal concepts is this idea of the anima and animus, so masculine and feminine, that in every male is hidden in his unconscious is really a female, which is repressed, and she can come to him in a man's dreams and in his aspirations and speak wisdom to him, and it's a feminine quality which is hidden, and it's inside every man. It's embedded as part of every man, has that feminine sensitivity, whatever it is, however you want to express it. And likewise, in every woman exists an animus, which is the male component, and it expresses itself in many different ways. And then going further, he starts to speak in terms of the spirit. If therefore we speak of God as an archetype, we are saying nothing about his real nature, but rather letting it be known that God already has a place in that part of the psyche which is pre-existent to consciousness, and that therefore God cannot be considered merely an invention of consciousness. We neither make him more remote or eliminate him, but bring him closer to the possibility of being experienced. So this, again, is a very Kabbalistic idea. When we talk about God, we've spoken about this a lot in the classes in Kabbalah. Really, God is just a name we're trying to describe something. It's a reference point. And in Kabbalah, there's no word for God, really. There's just ways of understanding God's expression. The highest level we talk about would be Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, And then we talk about names, shemot, different names. When we say Hashem, the name, we're talking about ways in which the divine expresses itself and how we can access it. When we hear the word God, all of a sudden we start saying, okay, it's a dogmatic kind of language. But if we understand God as it's a word, it's a symbol of how we're trying to understand and experience something, it takes a whole different kind of concept. So then he continues here, the psyche of the infant in its pre-conscious state is anything but a tabula rasa, blank sheet. It is already performed in a recognizably individual way and is moreover equipped with all specifically human instincts, as with the a priori foundations of the higher functions. This is in response to the behavioral idea. So the behavioral psychologists will have you believe that a person is born as a blank slate. So I was trying to look it up, I've forgotten which famous behavioral psychologist basically said, give me a child in the infancy and I'll give you whatever you want. You want a thief, you want a crook, you want a banker, I can do anything with this child. But that's a very reductionist kind of approach to looking at a human being, looking at a psyche, looking at a consciousness. As for me, as a young parent, and seeing I have blessed with two daughters, and they're both still very, very young, but from day one you can see already they have innate qualities and a disposition, and yeah.
Are these qualities coming from the soul, or they are instinctive based on our genetics, or bodily characteristics rather than something from upper levels?
Look, I mean, there's always going to be the argument, the nature and nurture argument, but I choose to believe that it's coming from a soul level. It's coming from a soul level. And look, I mean, is there any reason why two parents could have two children who are from day one so different? I mean, there could be environmental factors and stuff, but I know with my daughters, they're basically opposite, and their disposition, just everything about them is so different, and they're so young. So you could argue maybe that they're environmental factors, but it would seem far-fetched. I mean, from a Kabbalistic perspective, you'd say that every soul is drawing down and has a certain tikkun, has a certain healing and rectification that has to achieve in this world. And it's reincarnated, and there's so many factors that are imbuing it into this person that it would be that every person is predisposed to being different.
So nothing comes from genetics, from a physical elements?
No, of course things will come from physical elements, and then, I wonder if they do, twin studies with souls, I don't know, but, it's like, there's no way of really ascertaining that or proving it. I guess it's more of a perspective, yeah. Probably didn't answer you very well. But anyway, so if I'll just finish this paragraph. So if by employing the concept of archetype we attempt to define a little more closely the point at which God grips us, we have not abolished anything, only approached closer to the source of life. So again, like what really struck me about Jung is he's a psychologist, he's in that world of psychoanalysis, and he was actually one of Freud's prime students, and he broke off from Freud because he believed there's more to the human spirit. There's more underneath in our subconscious than just lust and violent and sexual urges. There's something very deep, very powerful going on that links us all as people, that links our destinies and links our minds, our consciousness. And it was him who coined up these concepts of synchronicity, where things kind of happen, and we see things, and you see someone and then you see them again, or you see in the same context, things sort of clicking. He came up with that concept. He's a scientist. He's not just sort of a practitioner of religion, a Kabbalist. He was a psychologist, but he found these common themes. He came up with an idea called synchronicity, came up with the concept of a collective unconscious, so that we could, at a period of time, tap into a specific kind of idea and concept that the whole world seems to be connecting to. Again, nowadays you could say it's just on a Twitter feed or a Facebook feed, so it's not really a collective unconscious, a collective conscious, all reading the same stuff. But maybe in a time where information wasn't traveling as freely, there were things stirring in the psyche, in the consciousness of the people, that established trends, and where things actually happened and evolved in a very unified way. So he looked at humanity as being almost like an integrated species. We're all connected somehow at this subconscious level.
Do
Do you want to? Yeah, go for it. By the way, this is an open discussion.
Oh.
It's just, I know it seems like a one-way conversation, right?
Is it publicized if Jung had any spiritual practice which helped him to connect to that depth which you described?
He actually, it's interesting, I was reading a paper over Shabbos, a phenomenal paper where it's called Jung's Kabbalistic Visions. And there's some criticism of Jung that, and if you do your research, you'll find this, that perhaps he was a bit of an anti-Semite. He was initially, identified himself with the Nationalist Party and not exactly connected with the Nazis, but thought there was something very powerful going on at the initial stages, that there was this idea of collective unconscious. So, but later he immersed himself in Kabbalistic writings, and at one point had some kind of nervous breakdown in which he experienced these very powerful, vivid Kabbalistic visions, which he documents. So I don't know if he had a specific religion per se, but he was definitely a very spiritual, connected individual who speaks of his dreams and his visions as concrete reality, not just, like a projection or, more, not like a Freudian perspective, which we'll look at next week, actually, dreams, but really as a dream is as real, a vision is as real as reality, or if not realer, because you're engaging a deeper part of your senses, a deeper part of your psyche, not just, the stimulus, the stuff that I can see and feel and hear and touch, but what I'm actually experiencing at a very core kind of soul level.
Can I just say?
Yeah, sure.
I've done a little bit of reading on him. He's one of my favorites. And he did do some experiments that took him deep within his own psyche, I understand. From what I've read. And that he kept a few people near him when he did it because he was afraid that if he weren't firmly grounded, he could go into some sort of psychotic break. And what he did experience was what you're describing, and that came from going very, very deep within himself, but making sure that he was somehow protected.
Yeah.
And that one of his final breaks with Freud was Freud's not wanting to share a dream, and Freud keeping himself farther away from other people, and Jung wanting to share. And when he saw how authoritarian Freud was, that Freud was above, that's when he really decided to split and came through what you were talking about.
Yeah.
And I just found that so interesting.
It's
the authoritarian position that Freud took as the mentor.
And he was, more exactly. Yeah, no, it's very interesting, powerful stuff. And at one point, he actually went so deep into his own psychology that he had some kind of breakdown, had a vision, and he saw this again. This, like I started with Elijah the prophet. One of his archetypes is the sort of the sage, on the man with the long white beard, which crops up in all cultures. And he actually had this vision where he saw this guy, and it was really, really powerful stuff. So I guess that's a bit of a framework to understand this idea of archetypes, but I'd like to actually link this in and move this class now towards understanding this from a bit of a Kabbalistic perspective. What does Judaism, what does Kabbalah specifically have to say about archetypes? And a lot, but for tonight's purposes, looking at the Patriarchs, so our forefathers, as archetypal figures who can transcend their literal interpretation, actually become a very, very powerful archetypal symbol for us. So I've got here, we're just sort of halfway down the page here with the Hebrew writing. This is a quote from a sefirah, a book on Chassidut and Kabbalah called Torah Menachem. And I'm going to read it first in Hebrew, and then I wrote a little sort of translation here as well. So, Mikiven sha'avez hein hamerkava, Hainu shekol evarehem kulam hayu kadoshim umuvdalim meinyonei olam hazeh. V'loi nasu merkava rak l'ratzon ha'elyon kol yemehen. Muvan shemitzadem shel ha'aves naflu kvar kol inyanim b'shleimus. Because the patriarchs are the chariot, that is, all their limbs are holy and separate from worldly matters, and their will is likened to a chariot being directed to the upper will, for all their days, it is understood that the patriarch's entire being is in a state of completion. So there's this really amazing idea, Kabbalistic idea. It says that the Avot, the forefathers, are called the chariot. If you imagine the image of a chariot, the chariot is completely nullified to the will of its driver, its rider. So the chariot will go wherever its driver is pushing the chariot to go. So the forefathers are seen as the first Jewish people, are seen as these individuals who achieved a certain state of completion where everything they did was an expression of the divine will. Almost as if they're spiritual characters, very powerful, very saintly individuals living in this physical world. Now, this is not to negate the stories of the Bible, rather to look at it in a slightly different way, that we look at the Torah as having multiple layers. And the bottom layer is what's called the Pshat. If you'd open up a Bible, the stories, that's what you're reading. It's a fundamental to Jewish belief that stuff all really happened. As hard as it is, some of it, to believe, we believe that happened. Okay? Those were stories, they were people, they had wives, they had children, they went places. All those things happened. Yet at the same time, the characters within the stories can somehow transcend their pshat, their literal interpretation, and become symbols, very, very powerful symbols, which represent very lofty levels in the whole Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, the Kabbalistic tree of life. And this is expressed in this next line here, which is one of the Divrei Chazal, one of the sayings of our rabbis. And it says, V'hinei maaseh avot siman labanim. A few people have probably come across that before. It says the actions of our forefathers are a sign, siman, a sign to their children. Again, the literal interpretation of the saying, the things that they did and saw and experienced and the struggles that they went through and relationships they had, etc., it's a sign for us. It's a teaching for us to tell us how to be. Just like, any story from your family or any wisdom teaching is about saying, hey, this happened to this person so you can learn from them. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. V'yadua, it's known. So whenever, by the way, just that's parenthetically, whenever it says in Kabbalah, Chassidut, V'yadua, and it's known, so usually it isn't known. Like usually you don't know it, but it's saying it's known. And it's a hint, so it's like known to the people who know, who are in the know. Like people who know Kabbalah and Chassidus, it's known. But the reason he has to tell us is because we don't know about it. V'yadua, and it's known, shahakavana, what's the true intention in this word siman? We're going to focus on this word siman, a sign, a symbol. Kan, lorak siman, it's not just a sign, like not just an instruction. Rather, elagam nesinas koach. It opens the possibility for us to be able to do these things. It's a netinat koach. I was having a hard time actually translating into what it means. It's like gives us the potential to do certain things. In other words, we're saying something very profound. It's not just stories. It's not just we hear a story, okay, our forefathers did this and that, they had a fight with this person, so we learn how to be just or kind or respectful. The fact that they went through a particular experience, that gives us the possibility of, when we encounter a similar situation, of having a similar result to our patriarchs and matriarchs.
So all those experiences were divine in nature, were driven from above. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a result of their free choice?
Not exactly, but we're going to touch upon that towards the end. You always like to bring out the free choice card. I'm still not going to be able to answer it for you. We're saying something very, very powerful here. Whatever happened to our forefathers and our mothers, the patriarchs and matriarchs, at some level it's embedded in our consciousness, embedded in our psyche. We were there, it happened to us. The struggles, the tribulations, the trials, the experiences that they had, they exist in a very, very deep place within our soul. So if you could permeate the depths of our soul, of our as a Jewish people, of our collective unconscious, then you could go so far as to say that deep within us exist our forefathers and foremothers, right there. So they're not just stories. It's not saying that, hey, they did these things and now it's a sign for you, don't do these things or do this, etc. But the fact that they went through a particular experience, the fact that they struggled, the fact that they opened up certain opportunities, that allows us to have those opportunities. That gives us koach, that gives us the strength, the possibility of actually experiencing those very same things. Very powerful idea. So how do we kind of take that idea and maybe put it into a bit of a model to actually to try and understand it, integrate it into, I guess, into what you call our avodah, into our own personal growth? is a very, very interesting model that this is from based on some teachings from Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who's a Kabbalist who lives in Israel, and it's about incorporating the patriarchs as archetypes, but using it as a model to understand our inner world. So we're going to go through these three stages in this model. Is it sort of making sense to this point? Resonating? Any questions? Pressing issues? Yeah.
Is it like homeopathy?
I don't know much about. Enlighten me though. About.
It's diluted for this still the essence.
I wouldn't say it would be diluted. I wouldn't say it would be diluted.
Well, it has to be. It cannot be the same.
Cannot be the same what?
The essence of these forefathers and patriarchs, it cannot be the same in each and every one of you. But there can be a fragment, there can be an essence of.
But I would say that actually if you would probe the depth of your psyche, if you had the possibility, you would actually find them inside you as they are in their pristine state. So maybe your experience might be diluted, like, oh, I'm trying to tap in right now, I'm trying to connect to Abraham, I need some faith, I need some strength, I'm going through some great adversary and, some real strong tests. So I'm like calling deep within me, I'm finding the Abraham inside me, or I'm looking for the Sacred Mother, I'm looking for Sarah Imenu, and I need that strength so I can actually go deep within and draw out. That's what we're saying. It's really, really strong idea. So inside you, in your consciousness, in your psyche, part of your collective identity, being part of the Jewish people, means that somewhere deep inside you exists the strength of Sarah Imenu, as she is. She's no longer just a character in the Bible. She is an essential quality which you have deep inside you. And you can find that. That's part of your inheritance. That's part of what it means to be part of this particular tribe.
So is it because their souls were sort of combination of a number of souls which are currently being divided into a larger number of people?
Again, no, in this case, we wouldn't say that. We'd say these souls are in their pristine state. So they're archetypal figures. In other words, as they are, part of you, part of us, part of all of us, are those forefathers and foremothers, as they are. So you might be part of Am Yisrael as a collective of the Jewish people, so we all sort of, you're talking about that Kabbalistic teaching, that fragments of souls, but we're not talking about it, you have a little fragment of Abraham Avinu. You, in the depths of your being, he's there. If you can find him, if you can access it, if you can call onto it.
In a complete form.
Well, yeah, I mean, not that there's, not that there's like a form, but I guess in the spirit energy, yeah. That's what I'm saying, it's a symbol. That's why you have to use this language of a symbol, like it's... But it's a symbol, but we can't get caught in the character. It's an idea. So it's, what does Abraham represent? Who is he really? What are his strengths? What are his characters? And then that's his soul that we're connecting to.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
Even in the word patriarch, you have the word within an arche, which in philosophy means foundation, or like the base building blocks of what something is made. And in the word archetype, you have the same thing. So a good way of putting it is the foundation, the base expression. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And in fact, before we go into the model, let's say that one of the, Abraham had, I keep saying Abraham, it's like a combination between Abraham and Abraham, just like you're saying Abraham. So I just say Abraham. Abraham went through 10 very difficult challenges, culminating with the famous challenge of being asked to sacrifice his beloved son Yitzchak, which was antithetical to his very nature. And one of the explanations of the question of why did Abraham have to suffer so much in his life and go through so many tests, because really what happened to him in his own personal story was he had this awareness of the divine presence. He became aware that there's something out there in a world full of paganism and idolatry. He lay there, and you can imagine doing it. He just lay there under the stars and the sun and the moon and just said, hey, there's something out there. I can feel it. I know it's out there. He had this very, very profound awareness of spirituality. And from that point on, his life was full of challenges, from being nomadic, from having his wife snatched from him, from fighting wars, to having to circumcise himself at a very old age, and culminating in this very epic, strange encounter where he was asked to slaughter his son. Why did he have to go through all those things? And I'll take from your word of this idea of foundation, that in giving birth to our nation of Am Yisrael, was saying that our forefathers had to go through certain very profound experiences in order to give us the possibility to endure as a people, as a nation, all the stuff that we've had to endure. So when we go through our personal challenges and you're like, wow, this is really intense, this is so hard, I can't make it, I can't do this, you have to remind yourself, we've been there before. And we've been in the hardest situations that mankind has ever had to endure, and we've survived. We've been there. I have been there before. How? Because inside me, in my essence, is Abraham going through that challenge right now, at some level, at some part of me. Again, it's about really going to the depths of what these stories and teachings are telling us, are saying, hey, they've been through these experiences, somehow it's part of you, and you can connect to that. So I think, that's enough to probably meditate on for a long time. But we will carry on. Okay, so how do we kind of take this very abstract concept, and again, I can say, hey, you've got to find your inner Abraham, but like how do we actually kind of do that? And what does Kabbalah have to say about using these ideas as a way for growth, for personal growth? So the first one that we're going to look at is about balance in giving and how we give. And that's going to be in looking at the relationship between the three patriarchs, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the assumption is that every relationship is based on two very simple things, giving and receiving. Okay? And the way in which we give and receive will determine the kind of relationship that we have with everyone, with everything, with the whole universe. How you give and how you receive to and from people, the world, the environment, your bank account, whatever it is, however you give and receive will determine it's the fundamental nature of all relationships. So Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov had three very distinct ways of giving and receiving. And more specifically, we're going to look at how they gave. So we'll go now to the literal part of Abraham. Abraham was, they say, kulei chesed, he was completely kindness. His tent, which is like what the chuppah is supposed to represent, had 4 open doors, and everyone and anyone was welcome in the middle of a desert to come eat. He gave and gave and gave and gave without wanting to receive anything in return. That was his nature. That was his teva. That was his innate nature, to give and give and give. We have a good friend, Abraham Wanunu, who knows how to give. You've got Abraham right at the forefront, so you don't even have to probe. It's your name. So Abraham knew how to give and give and give. Now, something interesting that it says also, the world's olam chesed yibaneh, the world was created through kindness. So the idea of creation was an idea of kindness. God wanted to be kind, to actually have creations that he could be kind to. So he created the world. And in Bereshit, the second account of talking about the world being created ends with this word bihi baram, which means as he created them. And if you kind of rearrange the words, the letters, it spells the word be'avraham, with Abraham, that the world was created in the same way. If you want to know how the world was created, fundamentally, with chesed, with kindness. But we all know what the problem is with too much kindness, too much love, and too much giving. If you give in an unrestrained fashion, free love, it can end with disaster. A simple example is if there's someone who's, let's say, has a drug dependency, and like, hey man, do you have some money for me? The worst thing you could do is give them like too much money, give them $1,000. You're basically killing them because they don't have a self-control. So unmoderating our kindness, our loving kindness, can be disastrous. But Abraham was someone who just gave and gave without without wanting anything in return and without restraining it in any way. He was, again, symbolically, he was the archetype of giving. So he needed to be completely someone who's completely has this idea of completely giving. Another really good metaphor, and we'll follow this through with the other patriarchs, is the idea of giving to children. You know this expression, spoiling your children. How do you spoil a child? It's like if you keep giving to them. It's very ironic. You spoil someone by giving them too much. That's what say, hey, you're spoiling them, right? You're giving them too many presents. You're ruining them. How are you ruining them? Because you're giving too much. But it's not the giving that's the problem. It's just not commensurate. It's not in measure with the recipient. So you're giving without thinking about what the recipient needs. You're giving, why? Ultimately it comes back to a person's need, their selfish need, to give. So a person will only give too much if they have a need that needs to be filled by giving. So it could be, I'm giving because I really need to give, but not because that's what you need to receive necessarily. And another way of looking at that is sometimes we have a need to give to ourselves too much. We become self-centered. And as love hides all blemishes, I'm giving to myself, but I'm not thinking, hey, am I giving to myself in the right way? So what am I doing? Am I eating junk food, or am I giving to myself? I'm going out and partying, or am I giving myself some quiet time? That's hard to disconnect, to unwind, whatever. So I can be giving, but it's not in measure to my needs. It's a pretty straightforward concept. So then we come to Abraham's son, Yitzchak, and he was the opposite. He was represented by Geveruah, this idea of strength and might. And you look at Yitzchak, he didn't have the same openness as his father. He wasn't interested in traveling. In fact, he never left. He wasn't nomadic. He never left Israel. He said, I'm staying here. This is what I want to do. And when he had his son, Esau, who was a wild man, and he brought home his reckless girlfriends who were offering incense to the pagan gods. So basically, at that point, it says Yitzchak went blind. He just couldn't, the incense caused his eyes to go blind. He couldn't see anymore. Strength, withholding. I'm not looking. I'm not open to this at all. I'm not engaging with you. I'm just going to become blind. And that's in fact, the rest of the story, how when he goes and gives the blessings to his son Yaakov instead of Esau, it's because he was blind. He couldn't see his son. So he could only touch him, and he had the hairy coat. But the point is that Yaakov had a lot of Geveruah. He was very, very strong. So in contrast to his father, who was all about openness, Yitzchak was very, very strong, had a lot of might and Geveruah and restraint. In fact, one thing that he is known for doing is that he was digging wells. He was going very deep. He was trying to penetrate to the core. He wasn't interested in the openness, he was interested in the depth. And for him, the way of experiencing depth was by withholding, being strong, being critical of himself and others. It's this idea of judgment. So you would think at this point that if you could take this example, the metaphor we're talking about in parenting, and this is something that we're currently struggling with as parents. You want to just give, but you have to be strong, especially if it's against your nature. So it's discipline. It's like, being strict, saying no, enough is enough, consequences, etc., etc. And in a world of free love, so having some boundaries and consequences is probably a good thing. It moderates it. So you would think that at this point, we've got a complete model. You have to have a little bit of Abraham and a little bit of Yitzchak. You need to know when to give, and you need to know when to hold back.
But also the circumstances, I just thought about it, like Abraham's day, there was no need for digging. So he received what he needed. The desert, the tent, this is his story.
That's right.
It's like divine gave the right circumstances for each one.
Exactly.
Yaakov had a different one again, because he had
different circumstances. In fact, it's true, like for Abraham's personal goals, if you look at his goal, what was the goal of his life? His goal of his life was to reintroduce monotheism to the world. Right? To say, like, let's acknowledge something that's above all creation. So in order to do that, if you're like really aggressive and full of Geveruah, full of strength, well, how many people are going to come to your shul if you only let in the most religious people and in the darkest black coats with the most furry hats? So you'll have 3 people in your shul. You won't be open. You need to have, if you want to spread a message and connect to people and have an ideal, you need to have food and you need to have openness, and that's it. But Yitzchak grew up in that environment. He grew up with the doors open all the time, and he was more interested in depth. So if you think about it, everyone's caught on to the idea, and he's like, well, who's going to be my chassid? Who's going to take this idea and let's go a little bit deeper with it? So yeah, he was trying to see what he could do, and he was trying to deepen the experience. So if we have those two perspectives of chesed, of kindness on the one hand, and Geveruah, what's missing? So, the Tifferet, which is Yaakov. So the problem with that is, the problem with just having these two perspectives without a third perspective is that the moderating Geveruah strength could basically hinder a person from giving. Because ultimately we go back to what was the purpose of creation, to give. The goal is to give. The goal is not to hold back. The goal is to give appropriately. But if you have a very strong sense of Geveruah, you could say, hey, okay, this person's collecting for charity. Is he legit? Do they really need it? Why don't they get a job? What do they spend their money on? Can I see your Coles bill? Is there, I don't know, whatever. People get like that. They get judgmental when it comes time to giving. And again, when someone wants to examine their own motives, I could give this person some charity, but do I really mean it? Maybe I don't really... Maybe I'm just doing it because it makes me feel good. So this Geveruah can actually become, this strength, this holding back can actually become a hindrance to the intention, which is to give. So along comes a third perspective, Yaakov, and he ties it all together. And he's called in Hebrew Tifferet, which we're translating here as compassion or empathy.
Talk about charity. Does it apply to the same like with religious people that talk about charity? Like, it's not how much. It doesn't matter how much.
To give indiscriminately, do you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you're supposed to give 10%.
Of what you have.
Yeah. You're supposed to give 10%, yeah. But if you're talking about halakha, if you're talking about Jewish law, actually, you're not supposed to just give all your money away to some random person. So let's say, like, there was an example. This is when I was studying in yeshiva in Jerusalem, there was a woman who was collecting every day, had a sob story about her son's bar mitzvah. So I was obviously a nice sucker, so I gave her, it's really a good story. And the rabbi after says, hey, you shouldn't give her. I was like, why not? Bar mitzvah? Her kid's been having a bar mitzvah for the last 20 years, Right? But I didn't know that. Okay, so the point is it's saying, okay, so the thing is, I don't want to, see, our job is not to be judgmental. But if you have that information, see, the problem with giving to her, so she probably needs the money, but the thing is, I only have, let's say, 100 shekels to give. And she's had the bar mitzvah for 20 years, but someone else really does have a bar mitzvah that they need the money for, okay? So we have to have a little bit of, but at the same time, this is where Yaakov comes in, this idea of compassion. Compassion says that ultimately my selfish need to give, or my need to be critical of myself or others, is put in the background of my fundamental compassion for caring about another human being. That's really what's going on in the background. I care about another person. And when you care about another person, when you care about people and you can have compassion and empathy, then despite the fact that maybe my motives aren't completely pure, and despite the fact that they might not be 100% legitimate, I can still bring myself to give to this person regardless. So Yaakov is the tying knot between the two perspectives of Chesed and Geveruah, is a third perspective saying the last ingredient in this idea of giving and receiving is compassion. And I'll give an example again in a relationship. It works better in a more mutual relationship between a man and a woman, that you can have giving and receiving. So I'm giving, I'm not getting anything in return, and the person's holding back or whatever it is, and there's conflict in the relationship, and you could be right. Like maybe what you're feeling right now is right, but because you have empathy and concern for the other person, despite whatever feelings that you're having right now, I'm able to put them aside because I have compassion. I can put my own ego aside and focus on the compassion element. So it doesn't mean that all of a sudden I'm just going to, open up completely or hold back, but I can use compassion as a way to reconnect to another person. So, or bringing it into the example of parenting, something that I've read in a book, and I think it works quite well. When you say no to a child, you say, no, you're not having that lolly, you can do it like that, that's the Geveruah. But the compassion is, you must really want that lolly. You really want it. but you can't have it. Okay? But the truth is, acknowledging that, having that compassion. So you're not all of a sudden becoming Abraham and saying, hey, I'm going to give you hundreds of lollies. No. And you're not being a full Yitzchak and saying, I'm locking the pantry and you're never coming into the kitchen again. You're saying, I'm with you. I understand where you're coming from, but I'm your parent. But I'm your parent, and this is my decision, and this is what has to happen. But you're still with the person in that time. So I'm not really qualified to give that. Okay.
Can he have the lolly?
Yeah.
Can he have the lolly tomorrow?
You need someone a bit more experienced than me.
Yes. Can he
So
have the lolly tomorrow?
maybe not. Yeah. Maybe not. Okay, so then we've gone through Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and just we're running out of time, unfortunately. We'll have to run this as a 5-week series. I wanted to make one more final point about Yaakov, which is really interesting. Okay, Abraham had 2 children, and they became 2 nations. We know the father of the Arab nation was Ishmael, and the father of Jewish people was Yitzchak. So Abraham's openness and kindness led him to having a son who was maybe... Ishmael in the end actually did teshuvah, but he didn't exactly have the kind of family that he wanted. Abraham. He had 2 wives, and then it didn't work out the way he wanted it to a certain extent. And at one point he even had to send his son Ishmael away. It was being a bad influence. He was too open, so it was being a bad influence on his younger son Yitzchak. It was very hard for Abraham, but he did it anyway. He listened to his wife. Then you have Yitzchak, and he had twins. So some kind of rectification. He had twins of Yaakov and Esav. So they didn't come from 2 different mothers, but there was maybe too much Geveruah going on there, and Esav was literally a wild animal. He was a murderer, and he said he was a Ish HaSadeh, he was a man of the field. He hunted people, animals. He was a really wild person. And he even tried to kill his brother on numerous occasions. So Yitzchak, with his strength, with his Geveruah, also had a hard time with his children. And finally, you have Yaakov. Now, Yaakov, also, his children didn't necessarily get along all that well all the time. But it says about him, mitosei shlema, that his bed was complete. In other words, all his children, they were different. They became not different nations, rather different tribes within the one nation. So because he had a more harmonious, compassionate outlook, his children were tribes, so they were almost like a more integrated into the one family. So he had 4 wives, he had all these different people, but they didn't go and form their own nations. They were tribes within one nation, which I think is an interesting thing about his own harmony, that he allowed, the good mix of chesed and gevorah allows a person to have their space, but also the appropriate discipline and to negotiate that. Okay, I think we're going to have time to examine the next model, which I think is going to be very interesting. So we move on to the second model here, the Patriarchs and the process of creation. We've touched upon this several times, and this is going to be, I guess, not do a complete justice, but for the sake of understanding how this links into the Patriarchs, there'll be enough information here to understand. In Kabbalah, we talk about the similar, a comparative 3-stage process in the creation of the world. The first stage is when there's just light, or Ein Sof. So it's a state of what we call or Ein Sof, the never-ending light, the worlds, not the worlds, the entire cosmos, all of reality is just filled with light. So God's infinite light permeates all, leaving no room for creation. So if God wanted to create a world in this state of complete light, it would be impossible, simply due to the fact that nothing could if there's only God, if there's only divine light, how can anything exist as a separate entity, have its own ego, consciousness? It can't. It's impossible. It's like saying you want to separate a ray of light within the sun. It's impossible. The sun is all-consuming. It's too powerful. So, to answer this problem of how God created the worlds, the Kabbalists have this amazing concept, and it's called Tzimtzum, which means contraction. In other words, God withdrew himself, made a space within that light, made a vacuum, an empty space, and withdrew himself from that space to create the possibility of existence having its own sensation, feeling of being an ego, like a sense of self. In other words, to answer the problem, how can God be everything, yet I feel myself much more than I feel God? It's because God created a vacuum, an empty space, in order to put creation inside that, so that we could essentially find Him again. Another way of looking at it is it's like this game that people play, hide and seek, that children play. So you hide in order that you should be found. So God hides Himself, and our job as children, it's also a beautiful metaphor. It's like trying to find Him again. He hid Himself, we're trying to find Him. Hide and seek. It's all just a game of hide and seek. Now, once we have this empty space, which is completely void of God's presence, so the way in which the world was created, we introduce this idea of, it's called kav, which is a line of light, a beam of light, which extends into that empty space. And the beam of light is actually not infinite, but rather finite. It's measured, and it comes in a measured fashion. So now we can talk about time and space and have constructs of worlds, because the light there's still a revelation of light. There's still God's presence. There's still spirituality, but it's tapered, it's measured, and it's more commensurate again to the vessel which we're trying to fill, which is this empty space. So
those vessels, are they full of light and they just burst because there is too much light, and there is sort of the vessels are not perfect to hold the light?
You're talking about you're talking about the world of Tohu? Yeah, initially, yeah. I don't want to go into that now, but we definitely could touch that upon it another time. So again, I want to use this example of children. I think it works very well. Imagine a parent who's so giving but so overbearing that the child has no room to be able to express himself. They have all these grandiose plans of how their child should be, and give them dinner and give them a massage and prepare their clothes for them and do all this stuff and pick their subjects for them. It's so caring, it's so loving, but it's overwhelming, and it doesn't give any room for anyone else to exist. When someone expands themselves so big like that, there's no room for the child to be their own independent entity. Another way of expressing that is, there's a story of a chassid walks into the shul and he says, Rebbe, what's going on? Everyone's stepping over me. Everywhere I go, everyone's stepping on me. The Rebbe says, if you don't spread yourself out over the room, then no one will step on you. Make yourself small. So here the parent is overwhelming the child because it's just or en sof, this never-ending light. It's just too much. It's too much. So what do you need to do? You need to be able to create some space for your child. You need to be able to remove yourself a little bit and say, hey, you're on your own a little bit, not completely. So the Geveruah approach is making that void. And that's, I guess, a journey, a very hard thing for a parent to do, I would imagine, is to say, hey, I'm removing myself completely from the picture to allow you to go on your own journey, to give you the space that you need. But imagine when the child wants or needs their parents, because ultimately the parent loves them, wants to give to them, and they feel that they're in this dark void of any nurturing and guidance. You're on your own, kid. This is your life. Imagine they just completely withhold like that. So there comes this idea of the kav, the ray of light, and if you use the metaphor of how the world was created, it's a very, very beautiful image. So imagine you have this complete dark space, and drawing in there is the kav, the ray of light being drawn into that space. It's like saying, when a parent says, hey, I'm available whenever you need me. And it's like a ray of light. The kid knows, even though I'm on my own, and even though you're giving me my space, the kid knows that I'm not alone, and that the parent's available, and they could call them, they can be there for them, they can love them. So again, in the case of reward and punishment and discipline, when a parent says, hey, you can't have that, and shuts them off, a kid can feel very alone. My parents don't love me anymore. What's going on? Even though they're trying to express love in a different way, in a way of strength. So instead, it's about saying that there's going to be that kav, there's always got to be that space, that third perspective, which allows for a more measured, a more compassionate approach. So we see how these three stages of creation also mirror, they're identical to the three patriarchs. Abraham being kulei chesed, completely kindness, the Or Ein Sof, the never-ending light, being completely expansive, Yitzchak being completely Geveruah, being completely withheld and withdrawn, might, strength, about creating that empty space. And finally, Yaakov bringing almost the best of two worlds. He's bringing light, but it's measured. So you have there the patriarchs as also found in the process of creation. So again, yeah. Right. Yeah, it was very hard for him. As I said, the hardest, why was the 10th test the final test? Akeda in Hebrew can also mean to bind you, like you're like bound, completely bound together. And the reason it was the hardest test is because it's the antithesis of what Abraham was. He was kulei chesed, he was completely kindness. And then God tells him to go and kill his son. Like even if we don't grapple the actual story, like how to understand what God actually wanted from him, but it's the antithesis of his nature. Yet he pushed himself to try and see if he could do it. And he was willing to do it. And at that moment he became bound with his son Yitzchak. So he integrated the ideas of Yitzchak. He sort of understood his son at that point, towards the end of his life. This idea of, in Kabbalah, talk about hiskolelus, which means an inter-inclusion, so their perspectives became intertwined. Anyway, I think that was, I guess, just an opening to see like how much there is when we sort of probe we're almost going to the subconscious of the Torah here. There's so much. We just take a simple story of our three patriarchs, which appears simple, and probe a little bit deeper, and it opens up unbelievable worlds of possibilities of really understanding and integrating these into our very being, and also finding them within ourselves. So just to finish, I'm going to sing a nigun, struggling a bit. Got a little bit of a post-Tishrei cold, but it's not about how it sounds, it's about where it's coming from. So this nigun is called the Nigun Hachana, and it's like a nigun which is sung at the beginning of when a Rebbe would give over a Hasidic discourse. There would be this nigun would be sung to put you into the mode of being able to receive what would come next.